There's a lot of boundary content out there right now, a lot. And most of it is teaching the same thing: how to enforce a limit, how to hold your ground, how to cut people off when they cross the line. Some of it is framed as self-protection, some of it is framed as self-respect. A lot of it, when I look at it carefully, is actually teaching avoidance dressed up as empowerment. And what I kept noticing across years of research and across my own work with people is that none of it was helping in the way it was promising to help. People were trying to set boundaries and it was damaging their relationships, or it wasn't even landing. Or they're exploding and then feeling terrible about it because they've reached that limit. Or even, situations where they're walking away from people and still not understanding what had actually gone wrong. And that pattern is what pushed me to start sharing this method more widely. Because the problem isn't that people are bad at boundaries. The problem is that the advice they've been given is starting at the wrong place. So I want to give you some context to why I trust this framework, because I think you deserve to know where it came from before I walk you through it. So this method was built from years of research and from pattern noticing, probably across very different contexts. 25 years working inside organizations and projects that had broken down and watching what happens when people don't know how to communicate what they actually need. And then 16 years of volunteer work in trauma impacted spaces, watching what happens to people under real emotional pressure. And what kept showing up in all of these contexts was the same thing. People weren't broken. They weren't bad communicators. They weren't emotionally incapable. They were starting at the wrong place and then wondering why they kept ending up in the same situations. And that is what the proactive needs and boundaries method was built to address. Because a boundary is simply an unmet need that is screaming out for attention. And here's the thing that changes everything once you understand it. The point of engagement is almost never the point of failure. By the time that most people try to address a boundary issue, the breakdown began much earlier. The social media advice catches you at the end of the sequence and teaches you to react there. The proactive needs and boundaries method starts you at the beginning. So what is it? What is this proactive needs and boundaries method? Well, it has three components. Number one, the 4 pillars of needs. So you can know what truly matters and how you naturally show up in relationships. Number two, the 4 stages of boundaries, so that you can recognize that boundaries are signals and not walls. And number 3, the 3 C's of asking, so you can communicate your needs and boundaries in a way that invites connection instead of conflict. And they work in order because each one sets up the next. So let me walk you through each of them so that I can tell you a bit more about what they actually are. So let's start with component 1, the 4 pillars of needs. And most people skip this step entirely. They go straight to the boundary conversation or the confrontation or the ultimatum without ever having done the internal work that makes any of that useful. And then they sit there and they wonder why nothing has changed. You cannot ask for what you need until you know what it looks like when it's being met. Most people are running on unexplored assumptions, a vague sense of what they want, a stronger sense of what they don't want, and very little clarity on what they actually need in a way they could describe to another person so that that person had no doubts about how that need should be met. And as I walk you through the four pillars, I find it's helpful to think of it as a house, like a house. Okay, so that's what I'm going to walk through in that space. So first off, we have your deal breakers. And your deal breakers are like the foundations. If the foundations aren't right, nothing that you build on top of them will hold. You can't, you can put up beautiful walls and fill the rooms with everything you love, but if the ground underneath is wrong, then everything becomes unstable. And that's why deal breakers are identified first, and ideally before you start building anything at all. I always think to myself, imagine how successful online dating apps would be if they made everyone put in their deal breakers when they created a profile. How awesome would that be? Not that I use them, but you know what I mean. How awesome would it be for everyone? Number two, your needs. Your needs are the structure of your house. The walls, the roof, the things that make it a house rather than a pile of materials. Without them, you don't have that stability. You can live in a house without furniture, but you cannot live in a house without walls or a roof or running water, electricity, all of those essential items. Number three are your wants. Your wants are the furnishings, the paint color, the decorations. They all matter because they're what makes a house feel like it's yours, your home. Make it somewhere that you actually want to be, somewhere you want to hang out. But you know what? The house stands without that stuff. And knowing the difference between what is structure and what is furnishings changes how you respond when something is missing. And the fourth one is your offerings. And that's like being you as the builder. What are you bringing to this build? What are you bringing to this house? And there are two parts to this. One is what you naturally show up with, the things that come with you without being asked, and what you consciously choose to show up with or choose to contribute because it feels aligned and it brings you joy, not because you have to or you need to or you're required to. Because knowing your offerings is part of knowing yourself clearly enough so that you can show up in relationships intentionally rather than just by default. And what shifts when you do this work is that you stop entering situations blind. You have something real and tangible, like a real baseline to work from. Component two is the four stages of boundaries. And most people arrive at the idea of boundaries already at the end of the process. They've tolerated something until they've exploded, or they've walked away without understanding why, or they've tried to draw a line and felt like they were being aggressive. And you know what? This is because they were taught to intervene at the hard boundary or deal breaker stage. And by that point, the situation usually has already broken down. Boundaries aren't walls to build to keep people out. They're signals telling you that something you need isn't being met. So the four stages of boundaries are triggers, soft boundaries, hard boundaries, and deal breakers. And they're a progression, not a single moment. And that progression begins long before most people will notice it. So we can use the house analogy to walk through these four stages as well, right? So think about that house that you've built that's all about you. And we'll think about it in the boundary context. Okay, and let's start with triggers. So imagine a trigger is someone that's walking, up and down on the footpath in front of your house. You kind of notice it, it's got your attention, but you're not really doing anything about it. You're just sort of, in the corner of your eye thinking, that's odd. Why is that happening? Some little trigger there happening. A soft boundary is that same person now in your driveway or your front garden. You're feeling a bit more tension. You still probably don't say anything. The signal's getting louder though, and you might still try and explain it away, but it's there. It's getting stronger. A hard boundary is someone banging at the door. They're at the front door, they've walked up, they're banging on the door. And by this point, the discomfort is impossible to ignore. You've got to answer the door. You've got to check. You've got to do something about this, right? And the response tends to be forceful. What are you banging on my door for? What are you doing? What are you doing here? That sort of thing. And then we have the deal breaker, the final stage, which was the same, as we talked about earlier, but I'll go into that in a moment. And that is when someone has let themselves into your house and they're standing there on your foundations. And the structure itself is no longer safe, and likely you probably no longer feel safe as well. And most people are taught to respond at the door banging stage. And the proactive needs and boundaries methods ask you to pay attention when someone first turns up on your street at that triggers point. And as I said before, right, just a little note on why deal breakers appear twice in this method. Because as a pillar, it's proactive. You identify it in advance before you're in the middle of something emotionally charged. As a boundary stage, it's the reactive endpoint. When the situation is no longer sustainable, you walk away. You walk away. And it's the same word, two entirely different moments in the process. Reading the signal early means you rarely have to reach the hard line at all. That wall response, that explosion, that walking away without clarity, those come from never having learned to read the signal early enough or understanding what need that boundary was protecting. The third component, the three C's of asking. And I want to name an objection here before I explain this one because I hear it all the time. People resist the idea that conscious asking has a place in close relationships. The argument is usually something like, well, I shouldn't have to ask for what I need. I shouldn't have to be this formal. Or, relationships aren't supposed to be transactional. I get it. I get where that comes from. And here's what I've noticed when I sit with it. The transaction is already happening. Whether you believe it or not, everything is transactional. Even if it's an energy exchange, it's an assumption, it's a feeling, it is always transactional. The only question is whether it's happening consciously or by default. And default is where resentment can live. Because every relationship involves two people with needs, which, let me be clear, they are responsible for individually. Those needs either get navigated consciously or they get navigated through distance, resentment, expectation, and eventually rupture. The three C's aren't about making relationships clinical. They're about bringing the other person into the process rather than expecting them to arrive there on their own or relying on assumptions of what we think they should provide. So the three C's are clarify, confirm, and collaborate. And the sequence matters because each step does a different job. Clarify is the internal work, getting clear on the need, what it looks like when it's being met, and what are the boundary signals when it's not being met. Confirm is the communication step, naming the need and checking willingness and capacity. It's not just about the expectation that someone else will provide that need for you. And collaborate is where you work out together how to meet it in a way that works for both people. And at this level, for the video overview purpose, what we're doing here now, I can tell you what the sequence is and why it exists. However, the full conversation mechanics of how to work it through live in the courses and the sessions, because that is where the practice actually happens. But what I will say is this. Asking isn't a sign that something is wrong with the relationship or that you're needy. It's the proactive way that something can actually get resolved. And you know what? What I've noticed across years of working with this method is that the shift isn't dramatic at first. It's more like things start making sense that didn't make sense before. You know, people stop being surprised by their own reactions because they have a framework for reading what those reactions are telling them. Relationships become less exhausting because less is being navigated by default, subconsciously. The conversations that used to feel impossible become possible, not because the other person changed, but because the approach did. And that's not a promise, right? I'm not here to tell you that you're going to chuck this method in and everything is going to be amazing in all of your relationships because everyone is different and it depends on the work that you do. But it is a pattern that I've observed over many, many years. And it just makes you more conscious of how reactive we all are in everyday life and how that shifts when we start looking at it from a proactive perspective. So, guys, if this is landing for you and you want to understand the method in more depth, there is a link below to the Proactive Needs and Boundaries method page on the website, on my website. And this is where you'll find what's available, including the first course, the 4 pillars of needs, which is where it all starts. I also have a limited number of individual sessions if you want to explore deeper with yourself or with your partner, so you can check all of that out below. Every other video in this playlist goes deeper into one aspect of the method or one of the contexts that it applies in. And if you're not sure where to start, the method page will point you in the right direction. So all the best. I hope that you find some wisdom, some inner knowledge from this. I hope that it can help you as much that it has helped me over the years. So see you next time. Bye.